Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the victims Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. 3 innocent lives taken in a way too cruel to comprehend. This story is deeply tragic and out of respect for their loved ones. We will not be displaying too many personal images of the victims. Their families have suffered enough, and the last thing we want is to add to their pain. This case is not just a crime story, it's a heartbreaking reminder of how fragile life can be. Behind every headline, every documentary, there were real people. A mother, 2 little girls, a baby who never got the chance to be born. They deserved happiness. They deserved safety. They deserved so much more. One of the most chilling true crime cases in modern history. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and drop a comment below because trust me, you're gonna want to talk about this one. August 13, 2018. A quiet suburban morning in Frederick, Colorado. A doorbell camera captures a woman arriving home after a late-night business trip. She steps inside, and then silence. Hours later, she's gone. Her 2 daughters gone. No calls, no messages, nothing. Her husband, Chris Watts, goes on television, begging for their safe return. His eyes look puffy, maybe from crying. His voice trembles. He says he just wants his family back. But something's off. A neighbor watches the interview and whispers to the police, he's not acting right. And then, the security footage comes out. The polygraph test. The chilling confession. What really happened inside that house? What secrets did Chris Watts try to bury? Stay with me because this story is about to take a turn darker than anyone could have imagined. A picture-perfect life, or so it seemed. Frederick, Colorado. A small, quiet town where families planted roots. Children rode their bikes down perfectly paved streets, and neighbors exchanged polite waves across manicured lawns. It was the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. And in the middle of it all stood the Watts family home. A 2-story, earth-toned house with white trim. A welcoming porch. A neatly trimmed yard. A driveway where a Lexus SUV sat gleaming under the morning sun. From the outside, it looked like something straight out of a real estate brochure. Inside, the walls told another story. Framed pictures lined the hallways, snapshots of birthdays, vacations, Christmas mornings spent in matching pajamas. In almost every photo, Shanann Watts stood at the center smiling, glowing, always full of life. Beside her, Chris Watts, her husband of 6 years, with his boyish smile and clean-cut look, an image of the all-American dad. And then there were their daughters, Bella, 4 years old, gentle and shy, with big brown eyes that mirrored her mother's. Celeste, or Cease, 3 years old, wild and full of energy. The kind of kid who could light up a room with just one giggle. From the outside looking in, they were the perfect family. And if you followed Shanann on social media, you felt it. Her Facebook page was like a highlight reel of a life many would envy. Videos of the girls dancing in the living room. Photos of family outings, hands held tight, love in their eyes. Post after post about how much she adored her husband, how lucky she was to have a man like Chris, who loved their daughters, supported her dreams, and always made her feel safe. But social media has a way of telling only half the story. Behind the smiles, behind the carefully curated posts, something was off. Chris had changed. At first, it was subtle. The way he stopped engaging in Shanann's videos, standing stiffly off to the side while she spoke to the camera, smiling only when she turned to him. The way his texts became shorter, his words less affectionate. Then, it became obvious. He lost weight, a lot of weight. He started spending more time at the gym, more time at work, and less time with his family. His phone, once an open book, was now always face down. He stayed up later, left earlier, grew distant. Shanann felt it. She wasn't the kind of woman to ignore the signs. She asked him, pressed him, tried to understand what was happening. Is there someone else? She finally asked one night. Chris hesitated. His answer wasn't no, but it wasn't yes either. Something was happening, and soon, the world would find out just how dark it really was. The day everything changed. It was still dark when Shanann Watts stepped out of the white car and onto her driveway. 1:48 a.m. The glow from the porch light flickered against the humid August air. She was exhausted. Her flight had been delayed, and she had just spent the weekend in Arizona on a work trip. She pulled her suitcase behind her, moving slowly, shoulders heavy with fatigue. The Ring doorbell camera captured her every step, the shuffle of her sandals on the concrete, the faint rustling of her purse as she adjusted the strap on her shoulder. A brief pause before she reached for the handle. Maybe she sighed. Maybe she gathered herself for whatever awaited inside. The door clicked shut, and then nothing. 5:27 a.m. A different camera, a different angle. This time, from across the street, a neighbor's security footage showed movement faint, blurry in the early morning light. The garage door of the Watts home slid open and a tall, shadowy figure stepped out. Chris Watts. He was wearing a pair of loose gym shorts and a t-shirt, moving with a strange sense of purpose. Not rushed, not panicked, just calculated. He walked toward his truck, a large, dark-colored work vehicle parked in the driveway. The back door swung open. He moved in and out, loading something. 3 trips. Each time, his posture tense, his movements rigid. If you looked closely, if you knew what you were looking for, you'd see it. Something was wrong. 7:40 a.m. Shanann's friend, Nicole Atkinson, tapped her phone screen again, her thumb hovering over the last message she had sent. No response. Weird. Shanann was the kind of person who always texted back, especially on a morning like this, with a doctor's appointment scheduled. But now, radio silence. Nicole's gut twisted. She tried again. Nothing. Called. Straight to voicemail. By 9 a.m., the unease had become full-blown panic. Something wasn't right. She grabbed her keys, got in her car, and drove straight to the Watts house. The driveway was empty now. No sign of Chris. No sign of Shannon's car either. But when Nicole knocked, no one answered. Her stomach knotted. She pulled out her phone and did the only thing she could think of. She called the cops, and with that one phone call, the entire facade of the Watts family's perfect life began to crumble. The lies begin to crumble. Chris Watts stands in front of the cameras, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His gray t-shirt clings to his body, damp with sweat. The Colorado sun beats down, but the unease on his face isn't just from the heat. Shanann, if you're out there, please, just come back. He stammers, his voice tight, forced. He shifts his weight from one foot to the other. His breathing is shallow. His eyes dark, restless dart from the reporter to the camera, then down to the ground. It should be a heartbreaking plea from a desperate husband, but something about it feels wrong. And the people watching, they can sense it. The neighbor's footage, a crack in the story. Inside the Watts' quiet suburban neighborhood, a small crowd gathers around a flickering TV screen. The glow of the footage casts eerie shadows across the living room. On the screen, grainy security footage from the neighbor's driveway camera. The timestamp, 5:27 a.m., August 13, 2018. Chris Watts' truck sits idling in his driveway. The engine hums. Headlights slice through the darkness. A dark figure, Chris himself, moves back and forth 3 times, carrying something heavy, awkward. But his story? I left for work at 5:15. I didn't see Shanann or the kids before I left. The air in the room thickens. The neighbor's brow furrows. His arms cross over his chest. He leans in, staring hard at the screen. Then, he turns to the officer standing beside him, lowers his voice. Something's not right. He's acting weird. I've known him for years. He's never like this. Chris, standing just a few feet away, lets out a short, nervous laugh, runs a hand over his head, shifts his stance again. His eyes flick to the screen. He knows what's coming. The officer watches Chris carefully, very carefully. This isn't just a missing persons case anymore. This is something else, something darker. The polygraph test, the moment of truth. A sterile room, white walls, a single table. The hum of a machine fills the silence. Chris sits stiffly in a chair, his hands flat on the cold metal surface. Electrodes wrap around his fingers, a cuff tight around his arm. The polygraph examiner, a calm but firm woman, watches him closely. Do you know where Shanann is? No. Did you physically harm Shanann? No. Are you lying to me right now? Silence. Chris licks his lips, blinks too many times. His chest rises and falls shallow, erratic breaths. The machine beeps. The lines on the screen sharp, jagged, chaotic. The examiner leans back, folds her arms. Her voice is steady, but her words land like a sledgehammer. "Chris, you failed." A long, heavy pause. Then Chris exhales, his face crumbling for just a moment before he quickly regains control. But it's over. The lies have cracked, and now, it's only a matter of time before everything shatters. A chilling confession. The interrogation room was cold, sterile. A single overhead light flickered slightly, casting harsh shadows on the walls. Chris Watts sat in the chair, his body stiff, his fingers twitching ever so slightly. He was trying to act calm, but under the fluorescent glow, every crack in his mask was beginning to show. Across from him sat Tammy Lee, the FBI agent who had seen it all before. Murderers, liars, men who thought they were smarter than everyone else. Chris wasn't any different, but what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that they already had him. She slid a piece of paper across the table. "This is your polygraph result, Chris." His eyes flicked down. His Adam's apple bobbed. "You failed." Silence. In that moment, the air in the room changed. It was like the walls had closed in a little tighter. The temperature had dropped a few degrees. Chris sucked in a slow breath through his nose, his jaw tightening. He knew. They knew. There was nowhere left to run. Tammy leaned in, her voice lowering. Gentle, almost motherly. "Chris, I don't think you're a bad guy." A pause. "I think something happened. Something you didn't mean to do." That was it. That was the moment. The moment his walls started to crack. Chris folded his arms, his fingers gripping his biceps, squeezing. His foot tapped against the linoleum floor. Faster, faster, then suddenly still. "Can I talk to my dad?" His voice was barely above a whisper. They brought him in. Ronnie Watts sat across from his son, confusion and fear written all over his face. He was a man who had raised Chris from a baby, had watched him take his first steps, had taught him how to ride a bike, and now he was staring at a grown man he no longer recognized. Chris leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his fingers locked together so tightly his knuckles turned white, his voice shaking. "Dad, I did it." Ronnie blinked. His lips parted like he wanted to say something, but no words came out. Chris swallowed hard. "I killed her." The words sat heavy in the air, thick, suffocating. It was like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. His father's face twisted in pain. "You what?" Chris dropped his head into his hands. "I killed Shanann, asterisk. Not the girls. Not yet." He wasn't ready to say those words, but the floodgates had opened, and once they did, there was no stopping what came next. Final moments at the oil site. Chris's voice was barely above a whisper. His fingers dug into his scalp as if trying to hold himself together. It happened so fast. Tammy Lee stayed silent, giving him space to fill the void. Chris sucked in a breath. Then, in a trembling voice, he began to describe the morning of August 13th, 2018. 4 a.m. He could still hear the soft hum of the air conditioner. The house was dark, quiet except for the faint creak of the mattress as Shanann shifted in bed. She had just gotten home a few hours earlier, exhausted from her trip. Chris was already awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. She turned toward him, her voice groggy. "We need to talk." Chris knew what was coming. The conversation they had been avoiding. The one about their crumbling marriage, about the affair, about the future she thought they still had. He sat up, swung his legs over the side of the bed. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. "Chris, what's going on with us?" Her voice was soft. He couldn't look at her. His hands were clenched into fists. "Are you seeing someone else?" Silence. Her breath hitched. "You are, aren't you?" His jaw tightened. A muscle in his cheek twitched. He turned to face her, finally meeting her eyes. "I don't love you anymore, asterisk." The words hit her like a freight train. He could see it. The way her shoulders stiffened. The way her lips trembled for half a second before pressing together in a thin line. "You're never gonna see the kids again, asterisk." That was it. That was the moment everything snapped. Chris lunged forward. His hands found her throat before his brain even caught up to what he was doing. The room filled with the sound of rustling sheets, gasps, then desperate, muffled choking. Shannon's nails clawed at his arms, digging deep, drawing blood. The bedroom was still dark, but Chris could see her eyes wide, terrified, pleading. He could feel her body thrashing beneath him, fighting for air, her fingers gripping his wrists in a final, desperate attempt to break free. 30 seconds, 60 seconds, her legs kicked, then slowed. 90 seconds, her body went limp. Silence. Chris didn't move. His breath came in ragged gasps. The weight of what he had just done pressed down on him like a lead blanket. And then, a small voice. "Daddy." Chris's head snapped up. Bella, 4 years old, standing in the doorway in her pink pajamas, clutching her stuffed animal. Her big brown eyes darted from him to her mother and back again. "What's wrong with Mommy?" Chris's pulse thundered in his ears. His brain scrambled for an answer. "Mommy's sick, sweetheart." Asterisk. She took a cautious step forward. "Is she okay?" Chris felt something deep inside him crack. He had seconds to decide what to do next, and in those seconds, he made a choice. Chris could feel his pulse in his fingertips. His whole body was electric adrenaline surging through his veins, his mind clouded with static. Bella stood frozen in the doorway, her little fingers wrapped tightly around the ear of her stuffed animal. The hallway light cast a soft glow behind her, illuminating the confusion on her tiny face. "Daddy," her voice was barely above a whisper. Chris swallowed hard. His throat was dry. "Mommy's not feeling well," he repeated, his voice mechanical, hollow. He needed to move. He needed to act fast. Shanann's body lay limp on the bed. Chris forced himself to look at her not as his wife, not as the woman who carried his children, but as an obstacle, a problem that needed solving. He grabbed a bedsheet and wrapped it around her. The fabric twisted under his grip as he pulled her onto the floor with a dull thud. Bella flinched. "What are you doing, Daddy?" Chris clenched his jaw. He couldn't answer. He couldn't think. He just moved. He hoisted Shannon's body over his shoulder and carried her down the stairs. Each step creaked under his weight. The sound was deafening. In the living room, he laid her body down near the garage door. That's when he heard it. Soft footsteps. He turned. Celeste, his 3-year-old, rubbing her sleepy eyes, her curly blonde hair sticking up in different directions. "Daddy." Chris inhaled sharply. His heart was hammering against his ribcage. Now both of his daughters were awake. Both had seen too much, but they didn't know. Not yet. "Come on, girls," he said, forcing his voice into something calm, reassuring. "We're going on a little trip." Asterisk. The words came out so easily. Too easily. Bella looked at her mother's unmoving form on the floor. "Is Mommy coming too?" Chris felt something twist deep in his stomach. He ignored it. "Mommy will be okay," he lied. "Get in the truck." Asterisk. The two little girls obeyed. They always did. They climbed into the back seat of his work truck, still clutching their blankets, their tiny faces barely visible in the darkness. Chris opened the garage. The night air hit him like a slap. This was it. No turning back. He gritted his teeth, dragged Shannon's body into the truck bed, and slammed the tailgate shut. Then he got in the driver's seat. The engine rumbled to life, and he drove. 45 miles, out past the town, past the streetlights, past the safety of civilization, out to the oil fields, to their graves. The drive was long, too long. The hum of the tires on the empty highway filled the silence, but it couldn't drown out the noise in Chris's head. In the back seat, Bella and Celeste sat huddled together, wrapped in their blankets. Their tiny bodies swayed with every turn. They didn't cry. They didn't scream. They just watched their father. The headlights cut through the darkness as the truck rumbled down a dirt road, leading to the oil field, an isolated work site where no one would be watching. No cameras, no witnesses. Chris pulled up to the massive oil tanks, their metal frames looming like giants under the night sky. A third site, a shallow grave, had already been prepared. He killed the engine. Silence. For a moment, he just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, breathing heavily. Then he turned around. Bella's big brown eyes locked onto his. Her little voice broke the silence. "What are we doing here, Daddy?" Chris didn't answer. He got out. The air was thick and dry, the scent of crude oil burning his nostrils. He walked to the back of the truck and opened the tailgate. Shanann's body lay still under the sheet. The fabric had loosened, revealing her pale arm hanging lifelessly over the edge. Chris's chest tightened. His breath came in shallow bursts, but he kept moving. He had to finish this. With both hands, he dragged Shanann's body out of the truck bed, the weight of her lifeless form sinking into the dirt. The grave was shallow, too shallow. He dropped to his knees, gripping the earth with trembling fingers, and started digging. The soil was rough and dry, clinging to his skin as he carved out a space just deep enough to cover her. Then he rolled her in. Dirt, more dirt, until she was gone. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, his hands shaking. It was almost over. Almost. Then a soft sniffle. Chris turned. Bella was still watching. Her little chin quivered. Tears welled in her eyes. "Daddy, what are you doing to Mommy?" Chris's stomach twisted into a knot. His heart pounded against his ribs. He walked toward the truck. Bella and Celeste shrank back, pressing against the seats, their blankets clutched to their chests. Chris reached in. His hands trembled. He grabbed Celeste first. She barely fought. The blanket was still wrapped around her as he carried her toward the first oil tank. A towering, rusted structure. The metal stairs groaned under his weight as he climbed to the top hatch. One movement, one push. The lid clanged shut. Silence. Only Bella remained. Chris climbed back down, his breath ragged. His hands felt numb. His mind was racing, but he didn't stop. He reached into the truck again. Bella flinched. "Daddy, no, asterisk," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "Asterisk, please, Daddy." Chris hesitated. For the first time that night he hesitated. Bella's little shoulders shook as she cried. "You're hurting us," she whimpered. Chris clenched his jaw. His body was stiff, frozen. He could stop, right now. He could pick her up, hold her, take her home, say it was all a mistake, that he lost control. But then her eyes shifted to the oil tank. Chris followed her gaze. He knew what she was thinking. She knew. Bella Watts, just 4 years old, knew exactly what had happened to her baby sister. She knew she was next. Chris inhaled sharply, his pulse thundering in his ears. He grabbed Bella. She kicked. She fought. She screamed. "No, Daddy, asterisk," she begged. No. She was stronger than he expected. But it wasn't enough. He climbed the stairs. Her cries grew muffled against the night air. Then silence. The hatch clanged shut. It was done. Chris stood at the top of the oil tank, staring at the stars above. His ears were ringing. His chest was tight. His hands were numb. For a moment, he felt nothing. Then he climbed back down, got into his truck, and drove away. As if nothing had happened. The darkest secrets revealed. Chris Watts had a secret. A dark, selfish secret that he thought he could keep buried. For months, he had been seeing another woman, Nicole Kessinger, a co-worker from Anadarko Petroleum. She was young, fit, adventurous. She made him feel alive again. With her, there were no bills piling up, no responsibilities, no fights about money or the stress of raising 2 kids. With Nicole, he could be someone new. Chris had whispered promises to her about starting fresh, about leaving the past behind. He told her he was trapped in a loveless marriage, that his wife was controlling, that a divorce was inevitable. But divorce wasn't what he wanted. Chris didn't just want to leave Shanann. He wanted to erase her. In his twisted mind, a new life with Nicole meant getting rid of the old one. No wife, no kids, no loose ends. But what he didn't realize, what he never even considered, was the price he would pay. And by the time the truth came out, there was no escape. The emotional and legal fallout. How justice was finally served. The courtroom was silent. The kind of silence that weighs heavy, suffocating, inescapable. Every seat was filled. Shanann's family, reporters, strangers who had followed the case, all gathered to witness justice finally being served. Chris Watts sat motionless in an orange jumpsuit, his face blank, his hands cuffed in his lap. Gone was the man who had once played the grieving husband on television. Now he was just a hollow shell, exposed, condemned, and awaiting his fate. Then Shannon's family spoke. Her father, trembling with emotion, stared directly at Chris. His voice broke as he spoke about his daughter, about Bella and Celeste, about the unbearable pain of knowing how they had suffered. His wife sobbed beside him, clutching at tissue, her body shaking. Chris never lifted his head. He never apologized, never showed an ounce of remorse. When the judge finally spoke, his words cut through the courtroom like a blade. "This is the most inhumane and vicious crime I have ever encountered in my career." Chris Watts was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 80 years for unlawful termination of a pregnancy and tampering with a corpse. No appeal, no second chances, no escape. As the gavel struck, a heavy sigh of relief rippled through the room, but no one cheered. There was no victory in this, only tragedy. Even behind bars, Chris Watts remains a haunting figure in true crime history. A man who threw away everything: his wife, his daughters, his unborn son for a fleeting fantasy. To this day, Shanann's family still mourns. Bella and Celeste will never grow up, and the Watts family home, it still stands empty, frozen in time, a silent reminder of the horrors that happened behind its walls. A legacy of horror. Chris Watts sits in a dimly lit prison cell. The air is heavy, stagnant, pressing down like an invisible weight. The walls, a sickly shade of gray, seem to close in around him. There's no escape now, just the deafening sound of time dragging on. A life sentence, no parole. But outside these walls, his story lives on. It lingers in the digital footprint Shanann left behind, her smiling face frozen in countless Facebook videos. Her voice filled with love and excitement, speaking about her husband, never knowing the monster that lurked beneath. Each post, once a symbol of joy, now feels like a haunting echo from the past. People still watch them, analyzing every word, every look, searching for the signs they might have missed. And then there's the house, a 2-story home in a quiet cul-de-sac. It stands empty, silent. The grass grows uneven. The blinds remain shut. A place that was once filled with laughter. The pitter-patter of tiny feet running down the hall, now abandoned, avoided. Neighbors still glance at it when they pass by, their stomachs tightening, remembering what happened behind those walls. Some swear they've seen flickers of movement inside, shadows shifting where there should be none. True crime enthusiasts, psychologists, and even paranormal investigators dissect every detail of this case. What drove Chris Watts to commit such an unthinkable act? Was it pure selfishness? A desire to erase his old life for a new one? Or something deeper, something darker lurking beneath his calm, composed exterior? The public fascination refuses to die. Documentaries, YouTube analyses, podcasts, each one unraveling the horror piece by piece. Some say this case represents the dangers of social media facades, the way people paint perfect lives online while hiding their true struggles. Others see it as a chilling reminder that monsters don't always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes they sleep right beside you. Even now, years later, the Watts family murders remain a cautionary tale, a reminder that evil doesn't always come with warning signs, and sometimes the ones we trust the most are the ones we should fear. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think there were warning signs that people missed? Was this premeditated, or did something snap inside Chris Watts that night? Let me know in the comments. And if you found this case as unsettling as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the world's most disturbing true crime cases. Stay safe, and remember, sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones we least suspect.